Shilian already kind of knew the answer to this question. However, Hua Cheng's reaction was largely different from what he expected. After a moment of silence, Hua Cheng suddenly blurted out, "I'm sorry." "What?" Shilian asked, confused. At first he thought if Qiandong Temple wasn't some kind of joke, then the one who would have the most connection to it could only be Hua Cheng. But no matter how off he might be with his guess, there was no reason for Hua Cheng to apologize. Hua Cheng didn't respond and only gestured for him to keep walking onward with him, and so Shilian followed his lead. The two walked for a while, and after making a turn, the sight before him opened to a broad horizon. A bedazzling, transcendent temple quietly appeared before Shilian's eyes. In an instant, his breathing stopped. All around was the smoky, dark, and vivid crimson scenery of the ghost realm. Yet surrounded by such an ominous backdrop stood the temple, beautiful beyond words, its thousands of lights enchanting, like that of paradise. That a temple with brilliance and enlightenment at its core would sit within the likes of Ghost City with its rowdy, chaotic pandemonium, it was opposingly conspicuous, yet awe-inspiring. The moment it had been seen, it would leave an indelible, deep impression. It took a while before Shilian could speak. "This," he said. The two stood before the temple, and Shilian raised his head to look. Hua Cheng also lifted his head slightly and explained. "It was the Mid-Autumn Festival a few days ago, and I figured Goga would probably join them in their annual boring games. So I set this place up to give Goga some amusement while attending the banquet, to make things interesting and relieve your boredom." His way of making things interesting was rather too shocking. For the sake of Shilian's amusement, he built a temple and raised 3,000 blessing lanterns of everlasting light. Hua Cheng lowered his head, fixed his sleeves, and then added, "I didn't want you to know because I set this up on a whim. I built Goga's temple in such a chaotic place. Pray Goga isn't offended." Shilian immediately shook his head. Hua Cheng thought he was giving Shilian trouble, so he didn't want him to know. Shilian really didn't know what to say. At this point, to say his thanks again would fall flat. Thus, Shilian steadied himself, sucked in a deep breath, and proceeded to admire this Qiandong temple attentively. A moment later, he inclined his head and asked, "This temple is gloriously magnificent. The artistry and craftsmanship in its build is divine. It couldn't have been constructed in mere days. Sanlang, you didn't just build this recently, did you?" Hua Cheng smiled. "Of course not," he said. "Goga has a good eye. This was built a long time ago. I never found a use for it, so I had it hidden, and there's been no one else who has been allowed in before. I'll have to thank Goga for finally giving it a purpose and have it see the light of day." Hearing this, Shilian let out a breath of relief. If it was built a long time ago, but never had a use, and had other intent at the beginning, then it was only adopted out of convenience. If Hua Cheng really had constructed a temple just for him, he would feel even more uncomfortable. Of course, with Hua Cheng's personality, it could very well have been built out of pure entertainment. Although Shilian was really curious as to why Hua Cheng would construct a building that was so completely different from the rest of the ghost city, still, Shilian held back the impulse to ask. It wasn't a good habit to pry too much. Who knows if one was to step on a landmine? "Do you want to go in and take a look?" Hua Cheng asked. "Of course," Shilian answered cheerfully. Side by side, the the two entered the temple leisurely, strolling through the path paved by jaded stones. Looking around, the interior of the temple was wide and open, but it didn't have a divine statue, nor any cushions used for worshippers to kneel. Hua Cheng spoke up. This was built in a hurry, so if there's anything amiss, pray Gogo won't mind. Shelian grinned. Not at all, he said. I think this is very nice, very, very nice. It's good that there isn't an idol or any cushions. Best if there won't ever be any. But how come there's no establishment plaque either? This wasn't a criticizing question. Only within the temple, even the jaded stones that paved the paths had been delicately engraved with the words Chengdeng Temple, and only the establishment plaque before the entrance was missing. So naturally, it couldn't just be a simple oversight, which was why Shelian was curious. Hua Cheng chuckled. It can't be helped. There isn't really anyone here who can write. Look at the crowd earlier. It'd already be impressive if they could recognize letters. Does Gogo like any particular calligraphy professors? I'll invite them over to help compose for the plaque. Or, the best solution, in my opinion, is if Gogo himself should draw up a sign and hang it here at the Chengdeng Temple. That'd be more than amazing. As he spoke, he pointed to the altar in the great hall. The jaded bureau was exceedingly long and wide. Orderly decorated upon it were various offerings and an incense burner. And there were even brushes, inkwells, and paper, a refreshing flavor of scholarship. The two approached, and Shelian said, Then how about Sanlang? Compose one for me. Hearing this, Hua Cheng's eyes slightly widened, as if not expecting him to say that. Me? He asked. Yeah, Shelian replied. Hua Cheng pointed at himself. You really want me to write? Shelian noticed his discomfort and asked, Sanlang, is there something wrong? Hua Cheng cocked an eyebrow and replied, Nothing's wrong, it's just... Seeing that Shelian was waiting for him to answer, he clenched his fists and replied, somewhat helplessly, All right, it's just, I don't write well. Now this was something new. Shelian really couldn't imagine that there was anything Hua Cheng couldn't do well. He smiled. Oh, really? Write something and show me? Hua Cheng asked again, You really want me to write? Shelian took out a few sheets of blank paper, laid them out neatly upon the jaded bureau, and attentively flattened them. Then he picked out a fine-looking purple brush and put it into Hua Cheng's hand. Come, he said. Seeing that he had everything prepared, Hua Cheng said, All right, fine, but don't laugh. Shelian nodded. Of course. Thus, Hua Cheng took the brush and started writing, assuming an air of seriousness. Shelian watched, standing next to him, but the more he watched, the more his face changed color. He really wanted to hold it in, but he couldn't do it. Hua Cheng, while drawing madness, writing recklessly on that paper, chided half warningly, half jokingly, Gogo. Shelian immediately schooled his expression. My bad, he said. Shelian didn't want to, but what could he do? Hua Cheng's handwriting was just too funny. In all the history of crazed writing Shelian had ever seen, none even held a torch to Hua Cheng's wild brushwork. Within the wildness carried a malevolent whirlwind and the air of evil. If any calligraphy professors were to see this, they'd probably roll their eyes back and perish on the spot. It took a long time, and it was with immense difficulty before Shelian could make out the sea, waters, the peak, clouds, and other such devilish characters, and guessed that Hua Cheng must be writing. No water is enough when you have crossed the sea. No cloud is beautiful, but that which crowns the peak. thinking of how Huachang, who dominated the ghost realm, who was feared by all of heaven and hell, finally showed such an expression on something, and when he wrote it was such verses, Shilian was going to burst his gut, holding in his laughter. He picked up with both hands the end product Huachang had completed with but one swing of his hand and forcibly pretended to be calm. Good, he said. It's got such personality, a great sense of unity. It's got style. Huachang placed the brush back, looking poised and proper, and said with a smile, Madness, you mean? Shilian pretended not to hear and started commenting with an air of seriousness. In truth, it's not hard to write well. It's writing with style that's difficult. If it was only to look good, but looked exactly the same as thousands of others, then it would be nothing more than common. Sun Lung has a good foundation, the talent of profession, the force to swallow mountains. There were two other idioms that followed. Broken landscapes, ruined armies. It couldn't be helped. Making up praise was also quite difficult. Huachang stood there, and the more he listened, the higher his brows raised. He asked doubtfully, Really? When have I ever lied to Sun Lung? Shilian asked. Huachang calmly and lazily added a few incense blocks to the small golden vessel on the side, and in the midst of the fresh, faint fragrance, he conversed with an air of nonchalance. I do want to write well, he said, but there's no one to teach me, and I don't know if there are any tricks to doing it. He certainly asked the right person. Shilian hummed and replied, There's really no trick to it, just... Shilian contemplated, but felt that in the end he couldn't just tell and not show. So he shuffled closer, picking up the brush himself, and wrote down the last two verses of the poem Huachang had written. It was done all in one breath, and after staring at it for a moment, he laughed with a sigh. Much ashamed, I haven't had much chance to write in many years, so it's not as good anymore. Huachang stared at the 4 verses that looked as different as heaven and hell, and the characters with styles foreign to each other, especially the last 2 verses Shilian added. They said, Crossing through blossoms, the eye is lazy, half fate in cultivation, half fate in the one. Huachang put the verses together and read them a few times, his eye twinkling and unmoving. It was a moment before he looked up. Teach me? He asked. Well, I daren't lecture, Shilian responded. Thus, he began to tell Huachang all about the introductions to calligraphy without holding back, providing insights and personal reflections of when he practiced calligraphy in his younger years. The perfumed air wafted gently, the bright lights shimmering. Shilian lectured earnestly, and Huachang listened intently. Within the great hall, they chatted lightly and leisurely, their voices low, painting a picture of softness. After a while, Shilian prompted, Why don't you try again? Huachang took the brush from Shilian's hand and composed himself solemnly before writing down another few characters. Shilian stood next to him and watched, crossing his arms and inclined his head. Interesting, he said, but he still felt that there was something wrong with the way Huachang wrote. He observed with a frown for a bit and suddenly realized just where it went wrong. Huachang wasn't holding the brush right in the first place. Even the way he held the brush was all over the place. Of course, it'd go wrong. Shilian didn't know whether to laugh or to cry, and stood closer, extending his hand to correct Huachang without thinking. You're holding it wrong, he said. It's like this. It's only when he reached out that he realized it might be inappropriate. The two weren't teacher and young disciple, so to instruct with hand over hand might be overly familiar. However, since the hand was already out, there was no reason to pull back. It did only seem overly self-conscious otherwise. Thus, after some hesitation, Shilin didn't remove his hand. Then he thought, the last time at the gambler's den, didn't Hua Cheng teach him how to roll dice with hands over hands? Although Shilin felt that he learned absolutely nothing that time, and there was even a slight sense that he'd been deceived somehow, this time he was sincere in wanting to teach Hua Cheng something. Thus, Shilin's warm palm was at ease, pressing close against Hua Cheng's cold hand, gently holding it, and carried it to guide the brush across the paper, whispering like this. He could feel under his hand Hua Cheng's brush growing wilder, so he exerted some force to control it, correcting its path. However, it didn't take long before it went even more off course, resisting the control, so he could only grasp it tighter. The characters drawn through the power of the two combined were crooked and twisted, unseemly and ugly, and the more Shilin guided, the more he felt something was off. Finally, he couldn't help but gape. "What?" he said. As if his silly prank was a success, Hua Cheng snickered softly. The ink on the paper was chaotically tyrannical, and Shilin was exasperated. "Sun Lang," he said, "don't be like this. Learn properly. Write properly." "Oh," Hua Cheng acquiesced. Just one look, and it was obvious that he was only pretending to be serious. Shilin shook his head, feeling ridiculous. Hua Cheng's hand might have been cold, but in his grasp, for some reason, it felt like a lump of hot coal, and Shilin didn't dare to hold on any tighter. Just then, Shilin's eyes suddenly swept to the edge of the altar, and he stopped. When he looked over at the corner of the jaded bureau, there was a tiny, lonesome flower.